Okay, seems to be slowing down a bit. For those who aren't aware, just to give a bit of background, you probably know Becky's already given one talk for us, which was fascinating on the roads around Southwark in London. She is post-excavation project manager for AOC Archaeology, and she's going to be talking tonight about the work that they've done near Alchester. So that's just to the south of Bicester in Oxfordshire. And it is quite fascinating. For once, this isn't about the Roman town itself. It's about what was happening around the town to the north of it specifically, which I'm certainly looking forward to hearing a lot about. Right, I think we'll make a start, if that's okay. Do you want to start, Becky? I'll disappear.
Absolutely, no problem at all, Mike. Well, thank you very much for the introduction. And yes, I am here to present the results of a large infrastructure project that AOC were lucky enough to be involved with. So as you can see from the title, we've got a few things to get through: Conquest and Change in the Hinterland of Roman Alchester. So basically, the structure of the talk will be a brief introduction. We'll sort of check out the location of all of this in space, the geology and topography, and so on. What came before the Roman conquest, because you can't really evaluate the change aspect unless you know what came before. Work our way through the Roman period. Try and come up with some explanations for the patterns that we're seeing, and then explore the legacy angle. So the wonderful thing about infrastructure projects is that you get to look at a big sweep of the landscape, and this has been immeasurably helpful for the conclusions, or well, formative conclusions that I'm going to present to you today. So basically, this is our study area here. This is Bicester. Alchester is located very close by, sort of down here. Just to give you a little bit of a closer look, that's basically where Alchester is, more or less, relative to the site boundary. And then you can see this is the east-west rail route, or it will be once it's completed. And our sites kind of break down into two halves. So we've got sites, they all have very awkward names that sort of vaguely overlap. Sites A, B, F and G have names that are desperately confusing. So we're just going to park those all at the door, and we're just going to have sites A to E over here and sites F and G over here, which hopefully will bring a fair bit more clarity to the situation. And you can see they're basically about 2 kilometres apart, either side of the very fascinating village of Launton. This basically means long tomb, long settlement, and you can probably guess from that it has Saxon origins, but more on that later. So here's our sort of key sites in the area. It's been quite well excavated, Bicester, so there's quite a lot of holes in the ground here to deal with. In terms of our talk, obviously the key things for this interest group are the Roman road. So we've got Akeman Street coming along here. It's sort of dog legs around this high point. This is Graven Hill, which again we'll be talking about as the lecture progresses. Alchester is here, which starts its life, of course, as a military installation. It's a fort, and later morphs into a civilian settlement. And then our sites are sort of up here to the northeast. So we'll be really focusing in on sites A to E, but we will be dabbling a bit with F and G as well, which have a little bit to contribute to all of this. So, and let's not forget the Dorchester to the Dorchester on Thames to Towcester Road here. So we're very well connected in this landscape already in terms of road infrastructure. So yes, so we're just gonna work our way through these bullet points: the geology and topography, look at the nature and extent of the Roman field systems and the impact that they had on the earlier landscape. Think about the relationship between all of this and Alchester, and then delve into the long-term consequences of all of this. But as always, the place to start is the geology and topography, because this pretty much shapes everything that happened subsequently in almost every archaeological site that I've ever worked on. So just to give you a sort of a snapshot of the topography, you can see it's pretty level. So we've only got a few metre difference in the sites that we're looking at, which range from about 69 to about 73 metres OD. But the key thing to remember in this landscape that is a metre actually makes a lot of difference in terms of the land use history, because as the Roman period moves on, it gets increasingly wet. So you can see we've got these little tributaries here of the Cherwell River system coming through here. And they become an increasing problem as time marches on. And those lowest reaches of these sites will start to become too wet to be productive farmland. So they'll fall out of use. And that will, as you will see, becomes quite helpful for us in certain ways about sort of refining the dating of our archaeology, of our field systems that we uncover. This is a geology map just showing you what's underneath. So the Cornbrash is over here. We've got the Kelloways and Peterborough members, which our sites are pretty much slapped on with a bit of alluvium sneaking in down the side of sites A and D there. But what they do is they sort of weather away to give quite a sticky sort of clay-rich subsoil, which in the past was sort of reasonably fertile, but not as fertile as some of the other regions in the central belt, which is where we're sitting. So essentially the central belt sweeps up through this sort of neck of the woods, and it's typically characterised by really, really rich soils. So we kind of go from Devon up through Oxfordshire as far as East Yorkshire, kind of in a diagonal across the country. And this is the sort of bit of the country that, you know, later becomes used for ridge and furrow and is quite intensively exploited for agriculture. We see this within our site as well. And I do wonder to what extent we might want to look for similar land uses in the Roman period elsewhere in the central belt, but we'll sort of double back to that towards the end of the lecture. In terms of what's happening before, I'm just going to very quickly run through the pre-Roman archaeological sequence before we really start to focus on what happens in the Roman period, which is really the main point of this whole lecture. So please bear with me. This is, I am aware that I'm talking to the Roman Road Society, but in order to sort of present those roads in context, we're going to have to sort of talk about a lot of other kinds of archaeology as well. So I'm sure no one will object to that. But essentially the prehistoric stuff is very limited. We get the sort of usual light artifacts, scatters of flint, sort of indicative of, you know, nomadic and semi-nomadic populations roaming around. There's a particular concentration across sites A to E of early Neolithic flint work. But really it's not until sort of the early Iron Age that we start to see more intensive features. So here in this part of the study area over on site G, we get, as you can see, lots of pitting and the first evidence for land division in the early to middle Iron Age. And I think really what these pits are signifying is more probably a small settlement of sorts. In Oxfordshire, round houses, you find them, but they're quite underrepresented. And so we think the reason for that might be that a lot of these structures are being built in ways that are not terribly archaeologically visible. So maybe using above ground cob walls or something like that, which means we find sort of the rubbish pits and the below ground sunken features, but not necessarily the dwellings. But we might be looking at some sort of early to middle Iron Age settlement in that neck of the woods, maybe. But on the rest of the sites, it's really not till the late Iron Age that things get going. And what we see repeatedly is the development of these sort of curved enclosures, which I think are probably used for stock control. It sort of tallies well with quite a lot of that work that Francis Pryor's done in terms of sort of herding and separating animals. So you're sort of funneling them through and maybe dividing them according to, you know, I don't know, the age of the animal or the sex of the animal or whatever it is. These sorts of enclosures would have enabled you to do that. It could be a bit mixed use. They might be living there as well. The artefact assemblages would kind of suggest that they're living very nearby at any rate. And we do have the remains of what might be one heavily conjectured roundhouse there. Structure 1, that is a possibility. So that's up on site A. The other ones are very, very similar, as you'll see. So I'm just going to fly through these, really. So if we go down to site B, you can see we've got a similar sort of carry on with lots of these, probably slightly multi-phase, this plan, but quite hard to pick apart. The dating and the stratigraphy just wasn't coherent enough to enable that, but you get the gist. We've got basically quite intensive land division, probably predominantly for livestock management, which fits well with the setting. We're quite close to a waterway. It would have been, you know, potentially quite good meadow at this point. And the same sort of thing on site D, essentially. Site F is very, very similar. And then over on site G, that pitting continues, which probably suggests that aforementioned early to middle Iron Age settlement could be continuing to this later period. So that, in a nutshell, is what's going on before the Romans arrive. But then when they do arrive, this is completely changed. So now I am going to make you sit through looking at this on a site-by-site basis to start with, simply because it's worth doing, just to highlight, under normal circumstances, when we're not doing these big infrastructure projects, the windows into the archaeology are much smaller. So it would be very easy to miss some of the patterns that we're going to talk about because of that. So you can see we have the development of a very different landscape. We're getting these sort of square and rectangular sort of coaxial field system going. And to bring it back to be a bit more on topic for you guys, we start to get these routeways inserted at regular intervals, which really we're just conjecturing from the arrangement of the field boundaries. So getting these long, narrow strips of empty space, which could have functioned quite easily as some kind of conduit or routeway through this farmland. So that's site B there. Just moving on, you can see we've got a similar sort of situation on site E, the development of all. Nothing to write home about at the moment, is there, though? But you can see the same sorts of patterns are emerging. Site D, it's a bit wetter on site D. We're edging towards the floodplain, so we start to see these ditches peter out, and this is definitely some sort of water management effort that's going on here. Maybe, I do wonder if they might be creating meadowland or something like that by sort of deliberately channeling the water from the nearby brook to maybe encourage the development of better meadow or something like that, something along those lines. But the really cool thing comes when you put all of this stuff onto the same plan and see the patterns that it's making, and then you realise that actually there's really quite a lot of order here that we might have otherwise missed. And you can see that on this plan where we combine all of that into one, and we have quite a lot of evidence for quite a lot of regularly spaced routeways, which are highlighted in this orange colour and conjectured accordingly. The ones in orange have actual archaeological evidence for their existence. As I say, generally speaking, in the form of flanking boundary ditches that are probably in reality defining the fields on either side of them, but they're leaving this long, narrow linear space in between that would have functioned very well as a trackway of some description. I would imagine they would have all been surfaced, but we've lost that because, you know, the upper reaches of this entire sequence will have been ploughed out. The ones in this sort of brown colour have been put on through the use of LiDAR data and in some cases historic mapping as well, because as we'll see as we go through this lecture, some of these routeways appear to be pretty long-lived. So it's a very regular, very organised, very well thought through field system. It's quite unusual. I've never rubbed up against something quite so organised in my archaeological career to date. with these very evenly spaced roads sort of forming these squares and rectangles. And you can see the scale of it. So we've got a 200-metre scale bar down there. So from routeway 6 to sort of routeway 9, you're pushing towards a kilometre really of space before it switches up to a slightly different angle on site A. And if you just compare the before and after, so the impact becomes immediately obvious that there's very little respect that's been shown to the enclosures that were there before, other than the vague alignment of them with the brook, which is playing a part in all of this, absolutely. But really, apart from that, things have really moved on quite dramatically by the time the Romans are interfering with this landscape, for want of a better word. So the situation on the opposite side, so we're now going to the east of Launton, to site F up here, is slightly different, but equally interesting and intriguing. So on this site, we get lots of parallel linear trenches, for want of a better word, that are quite narrow and quite far apart. So they're about 4 to 7 metres apart, and they have a really unusual profile, which I'll show you. So here you can see it's a very, very rectangular profile, resembling, for any of you people in the audience that are dirt archaeologists, very, very much resembling, to my eyes, a Roman beam slot, but they just can't be beam slots because the distribution of them and the length of them just doesn't really tally with that. You can see, again, we've got 50-metre scale bar down there. So these things are really long, you know, the longest of them are going on for at least 150 metres in length. So they're quite unusual. And we've interpreted them as bedding trenches. I'm going to kind of explain the logic behind this in the next few slides. So this site is not alone. Obviously, the best way to try and interpret and understand something is through comparative analysis. And you don't have to look very far in this case to find some good analogues, one of which is actually another EWR site, but it's over the Buckinghamshire border. So this is site 2A3, the catchy named site 2A3. And again, we have these very, very long, parallel, rectangular profiled bedding trenches that are about 5 metres apart in this case, which is a distance, isn't it, for a bedding trench? If you think, you know, if you're going to grow something like lettuces, why would you put them 5 metres apart? So, you know, it's intriguing, isn't it? Yet another example of this to the south of our site. So this is not an AOC site. This was dug before we started our EWR project. And you can see, so our site is basically to the north. This is Launton. So our excavations, sites A to E, are up there, but not very far away. Before we get to Alchester, which is sort of over here, we've got this site, Cemetery Park, which is very intriguing. So this plan is a little hard to read because it's multi-phase, but you might be able to make out a similar sort of network of kind of square and rectangular fields to the ones that we've found. And then within all of that, we've got these long, thin, parallel, widely spaced bedding trenches with rectangular profiles. So what is going on? And they're all quite nucleated within sort of quite a small area. We've got, you know, at least 3 as a minimum of these sites locally within the Bicester area. So after quite a bit of research, we decided that the most likely thing was particular with Wollaston in the Nene Valley, which is sort of, and sorry, I'm just going to try to turn my camera off because it's telling me that my internet connection is unstable and I don't want to lose any of you. So just bear with me while I do that. Apologies, everybody. There, hopefully that might make it a little better. Yes, so we compared our bedding trenches with Wollaston in the Nene Valley, and they are really, really eerily similar. So they're extremely long, just like our examples are, and you can see in the sort of the modern vineyard down there that even today this is quite normal to have these really long bedding trenches for vines, and again very widely spaced, just like our examples from the EWR project. And the reason for this, if you think about it, in a British context, there is a really logical explanation for why you would do this. And I can tell you from my own experience, because I have a vine in my back garden and it's to do with sunlight. So what you don't want to do is for one vine to throw its shadow on the other one. Because if you do, the grapes won't ripen properly. And in a temperate climate like this, they need every bit of sunlight they can get. So in my garden, the ones in the dark end taste like battery acid, and the ones up close to the house where it's nice and sunny taste so sweet and delicious, it's ridiculous, much nicer than anything you could buy in a shop. So sunlight really, really matters. And I think that's why these British vineyards seem to have the vines spaced very far apart. It doesn't happen in the Mediterranean. They don't need to worry so much, let's face it. What about the square profile, this weird rectangular or square profile that we keep finding? Well, this repeats itself at Wollaston as well, and elsewhere in Britain and the continent for that matter. And for this one, a delve back into classical sources is quite useful, because Columella writes quite a lot about how to plant a vineyard in quite a lot of depth, and specifies how you should dig the trench should be. And to achieve the correct depth and width, it's recommended to use a tool called a chiconia, which is this sort of X-shaped thing, and you put it into the trench, sort of a bit like that, and it dictates how wide it should be. And this creates, and how deep it should be as well. And in doing so, it encourages people to dig sort of quite a box-shaped profile. So all stacking up so far quite well. And then just to compare that profile with the ploughed out remains of a boundary ditch, just to try to convince anyone that thinks we might be looking at something else. They're just completely different. They're either V-shaped or U-shaped and just look nothing like those boxy trenches that I just showed you before. But really, we couldn't ever prove this beyond absolute doubt without some environmental evidence. So prior to the publication, we sent away some samples for analysis. So it's a bit of a drum roll moment. Will they come back positive or negative for grape pollen? And just remember that you don't need much at all, really, to demonstrate.
Becky, can I just interrupt? I do apologise. We're still having problems with the sound
because they are not native. Yeah. Okay, is that better?
Yes, that's much better.
Yeah. All right, super. Right, so just to reiterate for anybody that didn't catch that, so yes, the smoking gun would be the pollen, essentially. So we sent some samples off to see if we could extract some vitis pollen, and lo and behold, we managed to get 3 positive samples back, which is great, because if it's, you know, if you find even trace amounts of it, even very tiny amounts, that's enough to demonstrate that grapes have been planted somewhere in the vicinity, because they're not native and to Britain. So clearly these are an imported crop. So why have I segued into all of this? And it is relevant to the roads, and it is relevant to everything that I'm going to talk about subsequently, because it's kind of an indicator of an unusual level of, I would call it Romanitas in this agricultural landscape. And maybe it could be taken to suggest that are new people coming into this area to farm it? It's definitely not something that those Iron Age inhabitants would have done or understood or knew how to do, and they certainly wouldn't have dug these vine trenches in accord with the treatise by Columella. So with that in mind, let's just go back to that regular field system that we talked about on sites A to E, and just think about a few key points, because if I'm essentially trying to moot that this fieldscape is essentially a planned landscape, really, that's something that comes with quite a lot of baggage in landscape archaeology terms. And the first thing that any landscape archaeologist worth their salt would say to me is, okay, if this has been planned and it's not just evolved organically over time, then there must have been a reason for planning it. There has to be a motivation to plan it. So how was it done? Who did it? And why is the questions that now need to be answered. So this is the interesting part, I hope, of the lecture. So the first thing to do is think about the distances between those roads, and they're actually quite leading, because the distances are about 106.5 meters apart, pretty much. So this is quite neatly dividable by 3 into 35.5, which is about, give or take, a Roman actus. So they seem to be going in using potentially Roman measurements, which is great, because that seems to be pointing towards a component of measured survey happening. And if measured survey is happening, then that in turn points towards the hand of somebody that is capable of doing that, which is the army or the state, isn't it, really? Particularly early on in the period. And that essentially is the tack that I'm going to take. How would you have done it? Well, the landscape works very well in your favour, actually, because it's very flat, as we established in the geology and topography section, but there are some really key high points here in the form of Poundon Hill, right next to Alchester, Graven Hill, which is right next to Alchester, and Poundon Hill over here. And if you look at the, if you basically just draw a line between those 2 points, you kind of go right through Launton there, pretty much along the high street. And my EWR sites are pretty much located just basically to the north of that. So you could have got a very good vantage point from Graven Hill across this entire study area, really. This is a view pretty much across that baseline that I just showed you over to the other high point, which you can hopefully make out just sticking up there. So this photograph is taken from Graven Hill, looking across the study area to Poundon Hill. And it would have been an ideal point, really, to get a good feel for this landscape, and probably helped with any surveying that may or may not have gone on. So that sort of gives you a good setup for, yes, it would have been achievable here. You could have done it. But why? And sort of to answer that question, like, what was the purpose of it? What was it for? I obviously have to backtrack to work that's been done by other scholars, really. So it's been suggested, not by me, but several other people that have previously worked on this area, that there's a possibility, judging from the archaeology that we see, the Alchester area seems to be slightly different in terms of its land use patterns with the rest of Oxfordshire. So very in the same way that I showed you all those Iron Age enclosures getting slighted and replaced, that is a wider pattern that seems to impact across the area more generally. And it's been suggested that this could originate from the fact that Alchester Fort, obviously that gets established really, really early on, and it gets established quite close to where we think a tribal boundary might have been, maybe between the Debunni and the Catavolani. And it has been suggested, not by me, but other people, that maybe this tribal boundary, which might be a stitch, maybe, or perhaps the River Cherwell, needs to be secured. So to do that, it's been suggested that a chunk of the native populace are removed and sent elsewhere or got rid of in some capacity. So that would then create a landscape in the early Roman period that's a bit depleted, not as many people in it as there were before. Not every single site seems to fall out of use, so this didn't necessarily happen to absolutely everybody here. Don't be fooled that it's that simple, but this is the general pattern that seems to pervade. But if you have a landscape that's a bit depleted in numbers, it's not unreasonable to suppose that you might want to look at ways to make it more productive. So you might want to consider redesigning it and doing new things with it if it's not being as productive as it otherwise would have been, maybe. The other thing that is very, very interesting is the timing of the establishment of that very regular field system that we were talking about across sites A to E. Because very fortuitously, the lowest reaches, so those bits of it that get flooded quite earlier on as the water level rises up, that allows, I would argue, the dating of it to be firmed up a bit, because some of it is very long-lived. Some of those boundaries get recut in the Saxon period, for example. So some of it's really long-lived, but those bits that get flooded get sort of fossilised quite early on. And they also truncate those earlier Iron Age boundaries that seem to be slighted kind of at the start of the Roman period, whereas the pottery coming out of those flooded sections of the site is seeming to date to around about AD 70 to the early 2nd century at the absolute latest. And that's really a really interesting date, because this coincides with when most scholars think Alchester transitions from a military installation to a civilian one. And conceivably, maybe, this might be when it would be a really good time to redistribute some of that land to other people. And that's kind of what I think might be happening here, maybe. So it also fits quite well, I guess, with the way that land use around Alchester has been described previously. For example, Hennig and Booth described this spread of suburban farmsteads around it, which I think fits really well. Now, obviously, there's going to be people sitting in the audience who are sort of thinking of the C word, centuriation. Now, it doesn't quite fit with that, but that is a good place to look for sort of continental parallels, even though the size and distribution of these fields isn't necessarily a perfect fit for that. But, you know, maybe the motivation is kind of similar. And classically, that would be done around biggest settlements in Alchester, really, Colonia, but places where at least some of that land could be allotted to various people, but particularly military veterans, because that's part of the payoff for a chunk of the Roman period, at least, including the late 1st century. So what's really intriguing, although I wouldn't want to place too much weight on a single object, but we do know that we've got military veterans in the Alchester area because we have a gravestone from one, which was recycled as hardcore in the city wall, later excavated and reconstructed. So this is a veteran of the 2nd Legion, Lucius Valerius Germanus. So they're in the area. Make of that what you will. The other thing that has come to light in a site very close to mine is a very interesting document that was found down a well. So the photograph that you see on the screen, that is not the original document, which is tremendously poorly preserved. It's just a better preserved example of something similar. And this is odd because it's very rare to find a marker of literacy in a rural British context, for starters. But it's even odder than that in a sense, because it's been interpreted by Martin Hennig as, not Martin Hennig, I beg your pardon, Roger Tomlin, as a most probably some sort of property deed or lease of some description. So there's obviously, you know, a preoccupation with logging who owns what in this area. One part of that property deed would go to the person that owns the land. The other would be retained by the administrator and then sort of bound using the little holes in it, sort of into a stack of them, so that you could kind of organise who owns what for a particular area. So it's not, it's interesting to find it so close to the site. Basically, these are the EWR sites here, and the site in question is Bicester Park, which we've dropped in to our model down here. So this is basically, this area here is where the well is within this sort of enclosure where the property deed comes out of. And you can see also that the arrangement of routeways, which are shown in orange here on Bicester Park, fits very nicely really with the model that we've produced for EWR. So yes, so it is really interesting what's going on in the hinterland of Bicester, and it definitely needs further study, I would say. So just very quickly, we're now going to look at what happens subsequently, and the sort of the longer lasting impacts of this land use that lasts right through to the present day. And really it's the roads that do it. So as I've alluded to before, the first major changes that happen is that we start to get the water coming up. And so these earlier boundaries, particularly across the southern part of the site, Site E, start to fall out of use quite early on. So by the sort of the mid to late 2nd, early 3rd century, the absolute latest, this is starting to fall out of use. But a whole chunk of the rest of it carries on for much longer, and the routeways persist largely, we think, in different guises, and kind of hold this landscape together to a certain extent. And so you can see that this area has kind of reverted to meadow and pasture, but the routeways seem to continue to exist through it. And you can see just side by side there, the sort of the more regimented earlier Roman stuff against the longer lived bits of the field system, which by the time we get to the very late Roman, or more probably early Saxon period, actually, it started to become far less regimented. And we do start to get Saxon pottery from the top of some of these recut ditches, but there's clearly less consideration and care given to keeping up that kind of more square, rectangular sort of grid system that we had before. The furlongs of ridge and furrow kind of vaguely respect the earlier Roman landscape within the confines of sites A to E, at least. Again, probably because we have that road network holding it all together, and you can see that sort of on this composite image where we've got the routeways again shown in orange. In some cases, the former routeways seem to have been transformed into field boundaries, and they start to get a bit curvier, probably due to the nature of ploughing in this period. Well, almost certainly that. But things do persist, and as we move through sort of into the post-Med period, we get two episodes of enclosure that impact. The 1582 one is limited very fortuitously, I think, to the bit of Launton that the sites are in, and the enclosures that are produced by the 1582 process are smaller and respect the road network again. And for that reason, you can see on the 1863 map that I've put in here that we seem to get a lot of survivals in terms of the roads that we see today that kind of vaguely slot into the earlier routeway network. And just to show you a slightly more cleaned up image of that on modern mapping, you can see here that we have some clear examples of survival. So routeway 3 that is identified, all of these are identified, we think, all the way back to the Roman period, but this is now pretty much the equivalent of the A4421, which turns into the Bicester Ring Road. It's quite extraordinary. You can, in fact, there's a wonderful photograph of this at the start and end of the lecture. Bicester Road, again, that is a really good one, heading into the centre of Launton, where we pick it up in its earlier guises running through our site. Jarvis Lane is the equivalent of Routeway 6 on our site. It was always known that Jarvis Lane was of some antiquity, the theory being that it was of medieval origin, but I would contest that. I think we can push that back to the Roman period. And then once we've got this sort of foundation in place, the parish boundary down here starts to look a bit suspicious. So this lies well beyond our study area. It's recorded on the HER as representing an ancient furlong, but I'm not sure about that. I think it could, rather than it being medieval in origin, I think again we could be looking at another Roman routeway there. I have walked it, so it looks quite unassuming from the outside. It looks sort of like a big hedge, but if you sort of make your way through that hedge, you end up on sort of a very nice cambered, really, central road. It's quite hard to get the scale of it in a single photograph, but you can see there's two flanking ditches. I'm stood on one of those taking a photograph, and then they fall away to quite a formidable ditch on the other side, and it does really smack, to me at any rate, of something of a substantial routeway, but very, very intriguing. Anyway, I never thought I would say it before getting involved in this project, but a walk around the outskirts of Bicester is well worth it. If anyone ever gets the chance, I would love a second opinion. So do find it out if you're in the area. That's just a slightly zoomed in version of that, just to try and give you a little bit of a sense of the scale of it. Jarvis Lane with its ancient hedgerows is almost certainly of Roman origin, I think, based on the results of our survey. And then just to sort of bring this section to a close, really, the most dramatic example is probably Bicester Road, which has various guises that we pick up. The surface that you can see everybody excavating there is actually medieval, but to the side and below it are flanking ditches that are Roman and almost certainly represent the remains of an earlier incarnation of that. So this is bringing me round to my concluding remarks. In summary, I would say that, basically what we're looking at is we're looking at a load of late Iron Age enclosures. They're swept away at the dawn of the Roman period, maybe left to fester for a few decades potentially before they get replaced. Maybe, most probably, when Alchester starts to transition into a civilian town, perhaps around about AD 70, definitely no later than the early 2nd century, I don't think. We also have evidence of viticulture across at least 3 sites in this region, all quite tightly spaced. So is that looking at some sort of wine producing region here even? But either way, it is a striking example of Romanitas, really, in this rural landscape, I would say. In terms of transport, Alchester's really accessible, far less than a day's travel. And of course, we've got Aikman Street and the Towcester to Dorchester Road very close by. So it would have been very possible to export some of this if needed. This absolutely cannot be it. It's just a working hypothesis. It's just a model to be tested, really. So obviously further fieldwork is needed to do that. And also more desk-based study. I mean, one thing that my team are going to try to do before we get the monograph out is to show all the sites in the immediate area for the AD 70 to the early 2nd century on the same plan, so that we can get a better appreciation of the wider context. And you know, for some scholar, I think it would be very, very worthwhile just looking again at other candidates, perhaps in the central belt, maybe, just to see if we can find anything like this elsewhere. Because as I alluded to at the start, you know, routinely in urban contexts, we'll try to dot join between adjacent sites, but it's less common in rural settings. And maybe that's something that, as an archaeological community, we need to do more of. So yeah, that brings me to the end of my lecture, really. But I'm very, very much looking forward to any questions that you will no doubt have. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Becky. Yeah, brilliant. I've got a few myself, but before we get to those, I've scribbled a few down, and I think two of them at least you actually answered already, so I'll scrub those out. I haven't had an email through yet. I'm just checking. Oh, here we go. Yeah,
it's on its way.
Yeah, I've got it. Thanks, Susan. Okay. We've got comments and questions as usual. So what I'm going to do, I'll move that over there. Right. First of all, from Martin Packer. If there are two Roman settlements close to each other, could the two tribes have been forcibly moved into each of these two? I think that's with reference to the forcible removal of
yeah,
Trovotes,
I mean, let's face it, we have no idea what happened to those people. It would, you know, your guess is as good as mine, to be honest. It could have been very bad news for them. It could have been slavery. It could have been, you know, worse than that, or it could have just been clear them off to some other place. You know, we're dealing with the Romans. They would have been quite capable of moving an awful lot of people to pretty much anywhere they wanted. I have absolutely no idea, and I wouldn't want to guess where they went or what happened to them, really. But what I would say is that whatever did happen, it would have been seismic, wouldn't it? When you know, if this is real, if they really have been uprooted in the way that's been proposed,
yeah,
that the human cost there, regardless whether it's just, you know, you're going to lose, you're losing your land, you're potentially losing your social ties. It's tremendous, isn't it?
It is. When you were doing your some of the background research for writing all this up, did you find any parallels anywhere else for possible forcible removal?
No, I mean, I didn't really go down that rabbit hole too much. This is something that's been proposed previously by other scholars, and it fit well with what I could see. So I didn't really look for parallels. I think that it's quite hard, you know, that would be quite an undertaking, I think, to do.
Yes.
Because you'd have to almost do the same study again to do it conclusively. That's a lot of work, and it's not something that we can do within the scope of this project.
Yeah.
But it does sort of tie in, doesn't it, to that idea that we need to actively try to create or look for, scope out other areas that might be comparable, because, you know, it would be interesting to. It's unlikely to be unique, but I don't have a good analogue for it. No, is the short answer.
It does make sense
from elsewhere.
It's always made a lot of sense to me in that whenever you've got the army, you've got veterans from the army, and whenever they got a diploma, they had to get some land somewhere. So it does make a lot of sense, but I don't think there's been enough investigations into hinterland. That's what makes this one so precious. I'm going to press on. We might return to that towards the end. I don't know how many questions and comments we're getting, so I'll push through those, but we might come back to it. From Susan, were any faunal remains found, and if so, what animals were being kept in this area?
Yeah, I mean, we have the preservation of the bone wasn't great, so the animal bone assembly, it's very hard to add to the existing baseline of, you know, of animal subsistence with any conclusive, to any conclusive degree. And I've shied away from doing it because it's so scrappy and small. There's been some interesting work done. I'm trying to remember the name of the person that did it. I will. I can send you a link to the article, Mike, to pass on, but I can't remember it off the cuff. About
please
about
do.
Subsistence strategies before and after the Roman period, and that's quite interesting because they don't notice much of a change. So the argument there in that paper is for continuity, but I would argue, continuity in terms that those animals are still being used and fed to the army in Alchester, but it doesn't mean the same people are farming them. They could have been, there could be more to it than that.
I also suspect, knowing who's asked the question, that she might be interested as any equine remains.
Right. No, there is no.
It's been rumbled.
Nothing really stand out. We had a little bit of horse, but nothing, no articulated skeletons or anything like that.
Okay.
Yeah.
From Andy Stevenson, it's a comment. Interesting that there are no villa sites locally, so unlikely to be a villa estate. Therefore, may lend weight to the idea of numerous smaller farmsteads? ?
Well, I think that's probably a good point. Yeah. I think that's probably quite well made. Yeah, absolutely.
From Paul Wood, another comment. It's so great to see a different part of the country being scrutinised and drawing parallels to your own observations 150 miles away. I think he's referring to his own observations.
Oh, I'd love to know more about that.
I can put you both in touch. From David Breer, again a comment. I'd have thought the land on the hillsides would be better for vines? ? Better drained.
Yeah, I've had this comment a lot, because I think that's the assumption, is that is what they would do, but that's not what they've done, and the archaeology shows it. So yeah, like I might go, I'm not going to plant a vine down there because it's a bit soggy. I'm going to put them, up on the hillside, but we can demonstrate archaeologically that they haven't done that. And there must be a reason for it. And it could be as simple as land ownership, that's the land they've been given. Also, certainly at the start anyway, I think there's a definite attempt to really respect where the river systems are and drain the land by orientating the ditches very much in line with that. And I think if you remember on site A, the grid it switches a little bit, and that's because the river is changing direction slightly. Right. And I think they're paying really close attention to how best to drain the land to make it as usable as possible. So that might have ameliorated things a bit. Also, having chatted a fair bit with people that know quite a lot about keeping vines, it turns out they can withstand quite a lot of wet, but they just need a dry period across the warmer months when the feet aren't wet to thrive, but they're quite capable. I've been sent a picture of a vineyard pretty much underwater in the winter. Somewhere in the Balkans, I think it was. But the vines are just not bothered by it. They're not fazed by that. They're actually a remarkably resilient plant. They seem to thrive on neglect. They don't really care what the soil is. Obviously, that affects the wine, the taste of the wine, but the actual plant itself seems to be really surprisingly hardy.
I can certainly vouch for that. I used to have a vine in my garden. It's gone now. I got rid of it, but it was outside and then into the greenhouse, as usually done this far north. But in winter, the ground where it was planted was a swamp. for want of a better
Right.
word.
Yeah.
And it seemed to love it. It
Yeah,
really
mine's
did.
the same.
So,
It's very, very clayey and claggy in the winter out there, and it just
mm,
does not care. It just
yeah.
bounces back every year. It really doesn't care. Yeah.
Related to that, question from Bill Free. Where Becky describes the rectangular vine planting ditches, do these have a steady fall along them, or do they follow the contours? So I suspect he's thinking about drainage there.
Hmm. I think, if I'm going to answer this really honestly, that we probably haven't excavated that to a sufficient sort of margin of error to be really, really sure about it. It's not obvious. It's not obvious if it would make sense to do it like that, wouldn't it? But it's not
Yeah.
something that was archaeologically observable. You just need a digger to slightly overcut something, or it they were much of a muchness based on the data that came back pretty flat. But yeah, a fall would be useful, but then you've got to remember that they're infilled with soil, so they're not. Yeah, it might not have been, and the ground is pretty flat. There's not that much of a fall.
Okay.
So it probably wouldn't have made that much difference, I think, in reality. Um, yeah, they're on one of the higher bits of the site as well, to be honest. So that would have helped.
I didn't actually see it, but David Breer did actually ask the question, isn't the land a bit wet for vines? So I think we've dealt with that.
Yeah, but they were there. That's the thing. That is
Yeah.
the baseline assumption. And actually, when we were on site, that's what that was what we were discussing. It's a bit wet.
Yeah.
How can this be? But the archaeology is what it is, and they were there,
Yeah.
so it must have worked somehow.
Yeah, he also comments about the clay soil. Certainly on the photographs you showed, it just looks like solid clay.
It's horrible.
Yeah.
It's horrible. By a bizarre coincidence, and this is an utterly bizarre coincidence, the soil type on that site is quite rare. It doesn't crop up that. It's something like 2% of the entire country or something like that. But a bizarre coincidence is that I have exactly the same soil type in my back garden, which is also really, really clayey. And again, the vine doesn't care, at least not my modern variety of vine that I'm growing. So I think it's a bit overplayed, all this, because as I say, they are really, really resilient and not that fussy.
That's, as I said, that's my experience as well. Next one from complete change of subject from Martin Doherty. Do we know anything of the mechanism whereby land was transferred from the native population to Roman ownership? We should possibly put Roman ownership in inverted commas, but
yeah. Not really. I mean, we can't infer that from the archaeological evidence that we've got. Obviously, you can look at sort of more Mediterranean based examples. I mean, if you want to get into this, you need to be really going to classical sources that are talking about centuriation and how that worked, with the massive caveat that this isn't a perfect fit for a classical, for a centuriated field system as it is conventionally defined. But yeah, I mean, I think that is above and beyond something that I can really answer based on the nature of the archaeological record.
Yeah, I think certainly from Britain we don't really know, do we?
No.
We don't have enough information to go on. I don't want anyone in the audience to get the idea that all land was taken away from the native population and redistributed, because
No,
that certainly
absolutely
would
not.
not
And
the case.
even within the environs of Alchester, there's some exceptions. So it's not like a complete wholesale replacement. That would be really oversimplifying quite a complex topic.
Yeah.
So no, absolutely not. That's not what happened.
From McCoo, are there significant Roman remains at Alchester and where they are displayed? That's I'm not sure where that person's from.
Oh, you can see it. You can make it out as a crop mark. You can go on Google Maps and find it. Actually, it's very, very clear. But it's a scheduled ancient monument, so it's not. It can only be excavated under very exceptional circumstances. The University of Edinburgh's done some work on it, which is when the gravestone came to light. But it's sort of 99% in situ. But yeah, you can see it as a crop mark. If you go to probably looking at it on Google Maps is the best bet, to be honest. You need a bird's eye view to pick it out, but it's very visible. Yeah.
I don't know the area well. Is there a museum or somewhere that you can actually
because
go to visit?
there's not. You have to kind of know what you're looking at to really understand what it is. It's not like it's not as nice as going somewhere like Silchester or something like that. You can't really. I think you might struggle to pick it out if you were doing a walkover. But it's very clear in aerial photographs. Yeah.
Right. Still coming in. From Andy Stevenson, what knowledge do we have of the climate at the appropriate timescale?
It's reasonable. It's it's probably not that different now, I would imagine. It grows wetter in this particular area with time, so it starts out probably slightly drier than it is now. It quickly degenerates, and you see sort of flood horizons over certain roads and things like that. So it doesn't take long, probably about 100 years or so, to get significantly wetter, which is a very good thing for me because that helped to refine the dating of my field system, although probably not so hot for the people that were farming it in the Roman period. Yeah.
We have another question from Maku again. Vineyards need harvesting and wine processing, which is a very good point. Do you think there were enough population to do this locally?
I think there must have been, otherwise the vineyards wouldn't have worked, would they? But I mean, we can't demonstrate that archaeologically. We've not, we've dug up the fields, not the settlements. So I'm not going to be able to sit here and tell you a population or anything. But what I would say is that the vineyards seem to be pretty long lived. They seem to go the distance. There's quite a lot of stability there in that landscape, and they were a valuable resource as well. They cost a lot of money. You're getting these things shipped in as little plants. You have to raise them, is how it would have worked, to maturity, to fruit. It's it's quite an investment actually. So they must have made it work, and you could only make it work if you've got the resources to farm it, right? So that would be my inference.
I don't know how long vines normally last. Certainly the one that I had in my garden was pretty old, but did you get any evidence of recutting?
Go to Hampton Court, Mike. Sorry to interrupt. Go to Hampton Court. You'll find a really old one. It's hundreds of years old. That vine. Yeah. So they do last a long time.
So I was just wondering if there's any evidence how long lived the vineyards were. But if the vines last that long, then there'd be no need to recut the trenches, would there? Presumably.
No, there'd be no need. Exactly.
No.
So I think the fact that you get a lot of, let me put it like this, in other bits of the field system, you see quite a lot of change over time because people are presumably divvying up plots, selling some on, splitting them between kids as they inherit or whatever. The vineyards, they don't do that. They're pretty stable because they're a valuable resource. So you're not going to start splitting them up and destroying them. They're a long-term investment. And so we wouldn't see that, would we? It would be treated more like the rest of the site, unless they were successful.
Yeah, makes sense.
Yeah.
From John Barry, what are the physical signs that indicate the water table has risen over time?
Alluvium. So you get a layer of river mud essentially sealing things. and that is the primary the primary source of evidence. You also just stop seeing archaeology getting recut and reused. You get just whole sweeps of the site that just cease to be used. So it's fairly clear that it's no longer viable land. Yeah.
From Martin Packer, given clay has been mentioned twice, is it the same as in Headington? And is there any evidence of pottery manufacture?
No evidence of pottery manufacture at all. And I don't know where Headington is. I'm very sorry, please pardon my ignorance. I have to Google it.
I've got the map open in front of me and I can't see it, so I'm looking.
Yeah, and in what way as well? Like, in what way is it?
Sorry, Becky, I didn't catch that.
No, I mean, in what way is it similar, I suppose, is...
Right. I couldn't answer that. If you've got any information, Martin, if you're still there, if you can very quickly fire it through to clarify that, how the plates are similar.
Is it this Headington? Anyway, we'll find out maybe later.
Maybe. I've had a message through from Susan who says that's it for the questions. So if you have one, put it through quickly or you're late. No,
can I speak?
Is that Bev?
Yes, I'm afraid it is. I'm sorry.
Just for those who aren't aware, Bev struggles because of his eyesight with doing everything on the chat. So we'll let him ask a question at the end if he wants to. So yes, fire away, Bev.
Well, I'd like to ask a sort of question was asked about this, and that is whether the plant remains, floral remains, suggest that there were dry summers at the time. You did mention there were some floral displays, so I'd like to ask that. I'd also like to say that the Roman fort that was there was quite a considerable one. It wasn't an ordinary Roman fort, it was sublegionary. An important military settlement. So there was military environment there. The vines, although much later than the fortress, might be connected with that, or an environment that has subsisted over a period of time. And the last comment I'd like to make is that people, I think you also brought this up to some extent, but I'd like to underline this, that when people talk about the Romans, there weren't any actual Roman people there. They were all the locals. And it was the local county council that would be the people in charge of things. And they were Britons, British aristocrats. And so they may have had a hand in whatever was being organised. But I'd be interested about the floral remains.
Okay, well, there's quite a lot to unpack there. So for starters, with the palynology, we don't have the resolution really to because of the nature of the samples. So we took what's called spot samples as opposed to column samples for the most part. We did take some column samples, but they're better taken through alluvial deposits, which sort of they don't really have the resolution to divvy it up by year like a wet season and a dry season. The signature isn't quite good enough to do that. Partly, pollen tends to come out at certain times of year anyway, so that sort of biases it all. And to be honest, the nature of the environmental remains that we recovered just wouldn't have the resolution to answer a question like that, I don't think. The spot samples that revealed the vitis pollen are taken in such a way that you don't have the stratigraphy there as you would if you were sampling something that's naturally deposited in very fine sort of laminae or whatever. So yeah, it would have been an impossible question to pose because we just the data doesn't suit the question, if that makes sense. What else did we do? Alchester Fort, very cool. I've avoided this in this lecture because it's a bit controversial, but there is a debate raging about what Alchester actually was. There's a school of thought that thinks, you know, this is a legionary fortress. There's a school of thought that thinks it's an auxiliary fortress. I think the legionary contingent might get quite excited about the results of this project, but I will leave it for them to take forward should they wish to do so.
Well, the
because certainly it would be more in keeping with that, right?
the archaeologist Sauer, Sauer, has done a lot of work on this, and I think I always thought it was quite definitive.
No, it's definitely not considered definitive by the rest of the archaeological community. Actually, his work is a bit out on a limb. I quite like it because it fits quite well with what I've found. So I got a lot of pleasure from reading his stuff, and I do. It's mainly based on the discovery of the gravestone. The fort itself is a little bit small for a legionary fort, and he basically argued that it is a legionary fort because the gravestone is there. Now, I'm not sure about that, actually. I'm not sure one gravestone equals a legionary fort, and there's more than one way for a veteran to end up in this place. But I do quite like it as a premise because it makes more sense of what I've found in terms of, you know, legionary fortresses more commonly evolve into higher status settlements, and they're the sort of settlements where land allotment would take place. So, yeah, that's my thoughts on Alchester. And then the final thing that you mentioned was about who these people actually are, whether they're, you know, Romans or Brits, for want of a better word. I would contest what you said, actually. I think you're right for a lot of for most of the country, probably, but there might have been places where different things happened, and this may be one of them. Now, when I say Romans, that is, again, a gross oversimplification of the situation because it's an empire and these people are going to be coming from all over the place. Look at the gravestone. You know, the individual on that gravestone is not British. So we have an influx of people into the area, maybe not that massive, but they've come in. So it's going to be a mixture.
Okay, I'm not sure about that myself, but you may know better than I.
If I can just add a little comment on that from a Yorkshire perspective. There's been quite a lot of work, mainly geophysics, done around Aldeburgh. That's to the northwest of York, Missourium Brigantum, which was the civitas of capital of the Brigantes. Most of that geophys has been done by Cambridge University, but we've actually done a fair bit as well, along with a couple of other people. And the conclusion seems to be that we do have a fairly regularized landscape, but it's nothing like what you've got there at near Launton. It isn't. We don't have regular rectangular systems like you've got. Nothing suggesting the use of the actus at all. But at the same time, you do have farmsteads that are relatively regularly spaced.
Right.
At least one of those, I would argue at least two, possibly three, we have good evidence to suggest that these were not local people.
Right.
Two of them, the enclosures, look very reminiscent of Roman military. With geophys, two of those. The third one, there was a burial in a lead coffin, and it turned out that the occupant of that was from Sicily.
Wow, that's very cool.
So that suggests what I'm saying is that it could suggest a similar process to you've got there, where basically people were actually removed and then the land was divvied up for veterans. We can't prove it, but it's certainly a suggestion, and I suspect that may have been the case at various places across the country. But there's much more work needs to be done on that. Just had a comment from David Scotthorne. Apparently the gravestone is kept at the Oxfordshire Museum in Woodstock, if anybody wants to see it. And a Final one from Bill Free. Would the clay from the vine planting ditches have been suitable for tile making? Question mark. Seems very claggy.
I honestly have absolutely no idea. We don't have, we haven't found any evidence for pottery or ceramic manufacturing across our study area at all. But that doesn't mean they weren't doing it somewhere. But I have no evidence for that whatsoever.
No, you compared with a lot of sites, you do have a lot of smaller sites linked together that you're getting an awful lot of information from, but it's still a very small sample of the whole.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, I think the next step really, which could be quite powerful, is just to get it all on the, to get more of those sites across the Bicester area on the same map, and we are looking to try to do that before we publish. So I'll be very interested to see what that looks like. I suspect what we'll get from sort of having eyeballed it in kind of thing from the various different sites that we've got are a series of quite big but adjacent and sort of slightly changing in orientation series of grids rather than one massive thing that are respecting the water courses. I mean, if I'm going to be really, really honest and sort of pin my colours to the mast in a way that is quite hard to do when you're writing sort of a more academic text, if I'm just going to be a bit glib about, what my gut feeling is, for want of a better word, and please, everybody listening, just remember this is sort of my gut feeling and this is to be tested. This is not something, this needs further work, but I think maybe our definition of what centuriation is based on classical texts associated with Mediterranean countries for the most part, where the weather and the soil conditions don't matter as much as they do here. And if you want to successfully redistribute land in this way, you have to be a bit more mindful of the river systems and the topography to make it work. And I think, when we see that big overview of all the early Roman rectangular gridded out fields that have recurred repeatedly across the Alchester area, I think that's what we'll see. And I think, as archaeologists, we're quite prescriptive about this because this is what the classical texts tell us to think. But the reality of the archaeology isn't necessarily going to concord perfectly with that. But it doesn't mean that similar things weren't happening here. They're just doing it slightly differently because our climate is different. That's my gut feeling.
Can I just say briefly or not?
Very briefly, Bev.
Your idea of the Sicilian in Yorkshire, I would say that Yorkshire and the north is far more military, likely to have odd military people around than around Alchester. After it became a civilian settlement, there really is no military presence in the area.
That is sort of true, but not so much in the immediate area around York. So I wouldn't quite agree with that, Bev. Yes, in general in the north, you're absolutely right. But in the Vale of York and up into the Vale of Mowbray, probably not so much.
Okay.
Rowcliffe, which is the nearest fort to there, was only lasted around about 10 years. There's another fort recently discovered, Greg Thirkleby. The indications from what we can see from aerial photographs is similar, that it was a Flavian fort. No indications of anything later than that. So,
no, I was thinking veterans.
Well, yes, that's possible. That certainly is the case. But
lot more in the north, yeah.
There definitely are.
Okay.
Question from me. I'm guessing the answer to this is going to be no, but I'm assuming that some magnetometry was done on these sites before they were excavated. In which case, did any of these trenches show? Given the soils, I'm guessing not. But
it's a game of two halves in Alchester, unfortunately. So the clay does not come out well at all with geophys. So we did try it, but we didn't do very well at all. I think the Cornbrash formation is much better for this. So I'm told by the county archaeologist there, Richard Oram, very knowledgeable guy. So you know, the sort of game of the western side is pretty good for geophys. The eastern side that we're on is pretty poor. So that didn't help. But we did do quite well out of LiDAR. And of course, you know, comparing those historic maps with what we found as well, very helpful.
Was that a bespoke LiDAR survey that you did then at high resolution? Or
no, it wasn't. No, we just used the Environment Agency LiDAR and processed it in a particular way to get the hill, you know, the hill shading. This is something my geomatics department do for me, to be honest, Mike. I just tell them what I want and they do it. So I don't really know the ins and outs of it, but it was very good.
Yeah, I could tell you all about it, but I'd bore all the audience to death. So
I was going to start trying, and then I thought, no, you're just going to get it all wrong, and there's people watching know far better than you, so it's probably better just to be honest.
Anyway, that appears to be it, and we still have 140 people with us, which is great. So it only really remains for me to thank you, Becky, for an absolutely fascinating talk. If we're doing this person, we could have had some samples of imitation Roman wine to go around, but we can't do that on Zoom, sadly. But, anyway, oh, you're back up.
I'm back up.
Yeah.
Just to say bye to everyone, and thank you very, very much for having me.
Oh, you know, you're more than welcome, and thank you to everybody who attended tonight. I know that there were some issues with Eventbrite again, but hopefully it got resolved. I haven't had too many emails saying people couldn't get in, so fingers crossed everyone got in the end. Right, with that, we have one more talk to go in our series. I think there was one. It's Tony King is next. So he's had a good warm-up act, I think, but that's next month. And I'll email everybody to make sure you don't all forget. Okay, and with that, I wish everybody good night. Good night to Becky. Becky, quickly, you've done this before. You know, we normally have a little conflab.
Yeah, so I'll just stay on at the end.
Log out and then log in again.
Yeah, not at all. I'll log out and come back. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. All right then.
Right. So thank you, everybody, and good night. And we'll see you all again. Tony King's talk next month.
Bye.
Okay.
Thank you.
Bye.